Hello and welcome to another episode of Defence Uncut, the first dedicated English language Pakistani defense news commentary podcast, where we unpack Pakistani military procurements, events, and issues in laser-focused detail so you build an accurate and informative big picture. So let's just get into it. Hi Arsan, Asim, how's it going?
Yeah, I'm good. How are you?
Great. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. So, we have a bit of a two-parter with this particular episode. We will start off with a roundup of some of the top news stories from the past week, and then dive into our main topic for the episode, which is a discussion on the Pakistan Navy. Just a heads up to our listeners, Asim will be with us for the first half, but I believe he will be leaving for the second half. So let's start up with the headliner for this week. The Israeli strikes on Iran. So again, we don't have much to say on this as it is a developing story. I think for us, there'll be more information for us to glean in the post-mortem. But just a quick high level. So the Israeli strike happened in three big phases. The first phase was to deprecate Iran's military infrastructure. The second phase seemed to have targeted Iran's military leadership, and they were targeting very specific people, such as, the chief of the Revolutionary Guard Corps and the chief of staff of the armed forces, amongst four other individuals, I believe. And the third, and obviously the most crucial phase, which seemed to have driven this operation, was to deprecate Iran's nuclear program. So at the time of recording this episode, 6 nuclear scientists were killed. A couple of the leading scientists were replaced, or they have successors lined up. We don't have a lot of verified information as to what is happening on the ground yet. Then Operation Rising Lion, it started off, with a very strong conventional focus, which then, as we noted earlier, progressed deeper and deeper into deprecating Iran's more strategic capabilities. The Israelis in the opening night had used 200 fighter aircraft. I don't believe they were all in the air at the same time. There were different sorties and different formations being used. Again, not a lot of information on our end, not enough for us to basically use and analyze based on what's available to us at the moment, but we wanted to get that out there simply because it is a significant story in its own right, even though it's a bit adjacent to what we focus on. At the end of the day, Iran does border Pakistan, and I believe Pakistan's military and security and political leaderships, they are anticipating some sort of fallout as a result of this conflict. What that time will tell. So Asim, Arsan, any comments?
Okay, so let me just preface this by saying that when we are recording this, it's only the second day of the conflict. These are very early days. We know nothing about this. But let me just say something about the big picture. So there's a very famous thing in economics that's called the boots theory. But what that boots theory basically is that if you're a poor person, you cannot afford an expensive and nice boot. So you end up purchasing a cheaper boot, but unfortunately, it only lasts a very short amount of time. But if you're rich, you can afford to buy a more expensive boot, but that will last you much longer. So on the longer horizon, even though you bought a more expensive boot, you're actually spending less on boots because the poor person keeps on spending on the boot, like let's say every year instead of every 5 years. And the reason I'm telling you this story is this sort of reminds me of the Israeli-Iranian balance. So it's like a huge discussion, but Iran chose not to have a proper air force, or they chose to invest very little into their air force and mostly into a ballistic missile force. Israel, on the other hand, obviously invested heavily into their air force. Now, the thing about the air force is, yes, it's very expensive to buy out initially, just like the expensive boots. And on the Iranian side, right, they get like just like a cheap boot, they chose not to get the Air Force like up to date, but chose to invest in sort of like the lower tier, cheaper solution, ballistic missiles. But the problem with that is you don't actually lose an aircraft every time you launch an aircraft, or you don't expend the aircraft. But when you launch a ballistic missile, you expend the ballistic missile. So if Iran has invested, to buy 5,000 ballistic missiles and they launch all of them, at the end of that, they have no capability to, attack Israel. On the other hand, all Israel needs to do is buy more missiles or bombs that are way cheaper than ballistic missiles and then just stick them onto their aircraft. So that's something that I noticed about the decision to not invest in an Air Force. So I don't know, like, it's a very big discussion on why they didn't do it properly, but I feel like that's like one thing that could have been done differently.
No, that's really interesting. You know, in the lead up to this conflict, I would say even a few years before, when people were noticing that with Iran, there was a very significant bias towards revolutionary Guard Corps, towards, you know, things like proxies and asymmetrical conflict or asymmetrical warfare. They didn't really invest much of anything, even within the means allotted to them. You know, I understand they suffered sanctions and that sort of thing. That's true. But at the end of the day, even within the means that they had, like let's say talking to Russia, talking to China, what have you, they did not really build the conventional army, the conventional navy, and the conventional air force, right? Besides some really weird token projects here and there, they're mostly concepts and prototypes, basically. So there was a very top-down policy decision to not invest in the conventional military, and that could, and you know, it's a big discussion. It could have been maybe a result of the lessons from a political standpoint that they'd experienced during the Iran-Iraq War. From what I understand, the clerical regime didn't really trust the officers in the conventional military. Many of the leaders at that time were basically from under the Shah. But even after that, I think there might have been a sense that, hey, like, our Revolutionary Guards Corps, we know we can recruit the people directly. We know who they are. They're like, you know, top tier party loyalists. We can train them. They'll be loyal to the regime no matter what. Whereas with the conventional military, you have like more of a different recruiting structure. It might be more reflective of the wider Iranian society. So we're not too sure if we can trust these guys. So there's a lot of that stuff probably happening that may have constrained their conventional military development. Granted, they did purchase Su-35s, but like that's late, right? Very late. We're talking like from a revolution that lasted 50 years, you know, in the last 5 years. So for 40 plus years, 45 years, they weren't doing anything, you know, productive with the conventional military. So it's not just a technical decision. So from that point, we will go to our next news story, which is Pakistan increasing its defense budget by about 20%. So Islamabad's defense budget outlay has gone up by nearly a fifth. It's in dollar equivalent is about $9 billion for the upcoming fiscal year. That being said, because the overall federal budget is smaller this year, the defense budget does take up a greater share of the budget this year compared to last year. In terms of total breakdown, which are confirmed details, personnel costs will take up nearly $3 billion, operating expenses about $2.5 billion, procurement about $2.3 billion, and then civil works and infrastructure about $1.19 billion. And then separately, not included in the defense budget, pensions take up another $2.6 billion. So what's interesting here is that this year we didn't get a confirmed tri-services split of like where the allocations are going. Just based on last year, the Army took up about 47.5%, the PAF about 21.3%, and the Navy close to 11%. My projection for this year is that I do believe the Navy will see a higher share of the budget because their operating expenses will go up, right? They're basically expanding their surface fleet from, you know, 8 frigates to 12 frigates to 20 frigates eventually. So that is going to require, you know, an increase in overhead expenditure, which will require, you know, additional personnel, additional fuel, spare parts, maintenance, and all that sort of stuff factoring in. So for moving forward, I would expect year-over-year increases, gradual increases in the Navy's budget. The other thing I want to call out is that people will typically focus on the procurement line item, which is $2.34 billion. But you have to remember that only reflects a part of Pakistan's total procurement capability. And I'm not saying there's money hidden away that's coming into it. I don't want to get into that speculation. But rather, when you look at a current day defense contract is typically structured, it includes two main components, right? Let's say you look at the J-10 contract. So each J-10 costs $75 million per unit. It includes the flyaway cost of the single fighter. So that's the cost of the fighter as is without its spare parts, maintenance, training. And then includes the other stuff, just the spare parts, maintenance, and training components. So the way the military's budget structure is designed is that the $2.3 billion, which is going into procurement this year, would go into the flyaway cost of the fighter. Whereas the operating expenses would then, maybe not this year, but next year and the years following, will absorb the other part of the contract, which is the for example, your spare parts, ground support equipment, training, and what have you. So when you look at when you look at that, 2.34 billion, you don't want to make the mistake of saying, well, Pakistan military just signs a couple of contracts, they would have spent up their entire procurement budget. No, the way it actually is that basically that 2.34 billion will cover, one, the flyaway cost of the equipment, or the the upfront without the overhead, without the maintenance and support costs. And then it'll also be broken down further when you factor in things like loans and credits. So that, $75 million J10, let's say you sign a $1.5 billion contract, that gets broken up in, let's say, 6 to 10 years as well. So when you factor in all those elements, this budget from a procurement standpoint is pretty hefty for Pakistan, like relatively speaking, compared to previous years. And I think it'll probably remain as such for at least the next 3 years, up to 5 years, depending on how the tensions with India play out. Like if there's no track towards normalization or anything, then I do expect it to remain pretty high, which really puts Pakistan on the map as a procurement hot zone, which I think will make things pretty interesting for the wider industry, in the sense that this has been a market that kind of comes on and off. So, primarily because of things like sanctions and economic problems. So for the most part, Pakistan ends up relying on China. However, just when the funding does increase, Pakistani decision makers have more choices, basically, right? So that does open up the pool to competition. That's when you see countries like Turkey come in and secure some contracts. Others others from Europe as well. So yeah, I'll just call that out and say just keep an eye on that. And then some other interesting things that we noticed, which would be worth exploring, I think. So the defense-related spending within the public sector development program, the PSDP, have been slashed significantly. So it does sound like that there's some reorganization happening in terms of how money is allocated potentially. So it's possible that maybe due to some IMF or foreign creditor requirements, that the defense line items from the PSDP are being reorganized into the defense budget. So maybe the increase in part could be explained by that. So just to call out a couple of things. Now, that being said, in most cases, the funding that's being removed from the PSDP is pretty modest. We're talking about 50 million here, 20 million there. Not big chunks, but there is one big chunk that did get removed. So SUPARCO, so the Space and Upper Atmosphere and Research Commission, their budget went down from $232 million last year to $19 million this year, right? And that's pretty significant because we know as a fact that the armed forces definitely have satellite procurement requirements. They're deploying drones with satellite communication terminals. They're increasingly leaning on satellite navigation and location services for their guided munitions. I'm sure based on our first episode discussion, they might be a little bit more interested in having image intelligence assets up in space. So all these factors, they definitely need satellites. It just sounds like they don't want to get those military satellites through SUPARCO, it sounds like. So it's possible that the satellite procurement money, if that has been the case, is probably being rerouted to other entities like NASTAP and the PEF or NESCOM potentially, just to maybe guardrail the defense side of the equation, and also to maybe potentially free up SUPARCO to focus more on the civilian side of space. So Asim, what are your thoughts on that?
I don't have a lot to say, but I just have a couple of very quick thoughts. I feel like this is a reflection of the establishment's lack or dwindling of faith in SUPARCO. And SUPARCO is in a tricky situation, right? I mean, if you compared it to India's ISRO, that's a civilian organization. And SUPARCO started off that way as well. But then it was co-opted by the Strategic Plans Division and became a military organization. And that came with all of the restrictions on import and export that come with being a military organization, right? A strategic military organization. And that really stifled anything SUPARCO could do in the non-military sphere. So it couldn't develop satellites or satellite launch vehicles and all those things that it should have developed. So it did atrophy a lot over the past decades. And then this is sort of like a vicious cycle, right? Because it couldn't do much, it got less money, it couldn't do much else, right? It couldn't, and then got even less money. So I think this is just like a logical conclusion to that story, that the establishment is losing faith in SUPARCO. And as an outsider, so I mean, I could obviously be wrong, but as an outsider, my suggestion would be to split the embargo from the SPD and like make it an honest to God civilian organization, and put it to one side and let it do its thing, right? And I think that would be much more beneficial for Subarco and Pakistan.
Perfect. Thank you. And finally, the last big news topic. So Indonesia and Turkey signed a memorandum of understanding, or MOU, for the sale of 48 units during the 2025 Indo Defense Exhibition in Jakarta. The agreement was formalized by both the Indonesian president and the Turkish president, with senior defense officials from both countries present at the ceremony. Deliveries are scheduled over a 10-year period, with the first batch reported to be 6 jets to be delivered as early as 2026. And although Turkish Aerospace Industries itself had said that the first batch for the Turkish Air Force would come in 2028. So already there's some discrepancies in the details. The deal has been officially estimated to be at $10 billion. So it is Turkey's largest single defense export order. The initial units for both Turkey and Indonesia will use the General Electric F110, but the plan is to transition them to the Turkish TF35000 turbofan engine by 2032. Speaking about the Indonesian project, but I believe Turkish Aerospace essentially said that right now their plan is to sell 48 units, but the number could change, and even the value of the deal could change to somewhere 12 to $15 billion. So just at a high level, what I notice here that it is an MOU, and in Pakistan we don't take, I think we take MOUs a bit too seriously, and maybe these end up being agreements that sound great on paper, but they remain on paper and they don't typically materialize into firm commitments. There's also the fact that Indonesia has a bit of a checkered history with fighter procurements. They have signed contracts or made commitments at different points to Russia for the Su-35, then to France for the Rafale, then to South Korea for the KF-21, and then to China for the J-10. So it seems that their procurement policies typically shift very rapidly for one reason or the other. As to why, it's not clear why. Fiscally fairly strong, so there's something else going on, and maybe how they manage procurements that tends to result in a lot of instability. And the third factor is that the KAAN, it's still in relatively early development. I mean, there's not much for for a user to evaluate except for the very initial prototype, and there's no combat testing, no weapons testing yet. So basically, Indonesia potentially might have gotten a relatively good deal by signing in early. But again, even Turkish Aerospace, it is putting in a caveat that the total value, the total estimate could potentially go up by, $2 to $5 billion, right? So this price isn't necessarily locked in stone. It's just more of a rough idea of the KAAN's, intended pricing from Turkey's point of view. And obviously, Turkey has an interest in driving orders for the KAAN so that can develop, it can build economies of scale, reduce the unit cost by distributing the R&D overhead across many units. So they've been seeking orders from not just Indonesia, but also Azerbaijan, Pakistan, Qatar, and other countries to sort of get that momentum. So I think overall, this contract is somewhat up in the air, but I don't want to dismiss it entirely. I think the fact that it was signed by two head of states is significant, that there are a lot of very specific details surrounding pricing, delivery timelines, and planning that you don't typically see in a very high-level non-committal agreement. This sort of reminds me of the MOUs that Pakistan used to sign with Turkey before the MILGEM and T129 deals were finalized. So these were more of like stepping stones towards firm contracts. Like not quite there yet, but at the same time not unserious. So it could be like a prelude to proper negotiations that'll probably start from this point on. Just my thoughts on the matter. What about you, Asim?
Yeah, so I just have a couple of things to say on this as well. So one thing that, is very popular in Pakistan defense circles is to discuss the fact that Pakistan is one of the earliest and one of the most serious partners in the KAAN program, right? And there've been several MOUs on, collaboration on the KAAN project, right? But I just want to throw this out there, right? There is, even though Pakistan loves to announce and sign MOUs, currently there's no MOU with Pakistan that goes into as much detail as the Indonesian MOU did. So this should tell people about the commitment level that Pakistan has with the KAAN project right now, right? So just putting this out there. Now, as you said, is looking, Turkish Aerospace is looking for partners in the KAAN because KAAN is a very strategic project for Turkey, right? They want to go through it no matter what. I mean, kind of like the nuclear program was for Pakistan, right? And that's the kind of importance they attach to KAAN. And the second thing is, I don't think any country, maybe except China or the United States, can hope to develop a fifth generation fighter aircraft on their own. Obviously, they're looking for partners and investment. So, as we know, they're looking for partners and investment from Pakistan, Indonesia, Qatar, Azerbaijan, right? So, anywhere they can get any cash injection into the program is beneficial for them. And that cash injection could be in terms of development costs or orders. It doesn't matter to them that much how that money is coming in, except the fact that it does. And now it's also very standard for aircraft manufacturers that plan to sell, let's say, a certain number of aircraft to make a loss on the initial aircraft that they sell, right? Just so they can sign orders. And then once they get economies of scale, they start making profits eventually. But I think it's pretty standard to make a loss on the initial units. With that being said, even keeping the loss making on the initial orders in mind, $10 billion does seem like a small amount. Because keep in mind, whenever there's like a deal for aircraft, almost never just the aircraft, right? So there's spares, there's training, and there's ammunition and all that stuff. So a good rule of thumb is like just double the aircraft value, and that's your deal value, right? So it does feel like $10 billion is a small amount. And as you said, even the people at Turkish Aerospace realize that this number will go up. The final thing that I wanted to talk about was the KF-21, because that's the aircraft that Indonesia was most committed to in one sense, right? Because they were sort of like a development/investment partner. And it's kind of like a fifth generation fighter aircraft. I think they call it the 4.75 generation because the initial prototypes carry like armaments outside the aircraft and stuff. And the KAAN is obviously a much bigger aircraft than the KF-21, but they are roughly comparable. So it's kind of strange that they would, presumably back out from that program and then sign on to KAAN, right? So I don't know what the logic behind that is. Maybe it's just, like you said, that they're just jumping around, or maybe there's some logic to it.
So I think from what I understand, the funding towards the KF-21 is still ongoing. However, it was reduced quite a bit from the initial commitment. So I believe the initial commitment towards the KF-21 was something like taking up to 25% of the project scope. And then over the subsequent years, Indonesia kept negotiating that down. So I believe they are probably closer to 10%, if not under 10%. I think, again, it could just be that they've signed an MOU with the goal of negotiating a finalized deal down the line. So it just might not be final. But again, it's really interesting. And I think this might be a bit of signaling from Turkey's standpoint to potential customers that these are the numbers you're going to probably deal with. So maybe even though the Indonesian deal hasn't been fully finalized, it hasn't been actioned yet. There's no Indonesian unit in production, for example. This is going to take a while. However, I think what Turkish Aerospace wants to get out of this is, hey, like this is how much the aircraft is going to cost you if you sign up right now, right? 200 or so million per unit, including the all-in cost, is very low for this kind of program. So if you're interested in getting this kind of lock-in, you should basically talk to us right now, because down the line it will go up. And that could be a potential like indirect signal to countries like Pakistan, Azerbaijan to, okay, like you need to commit openly as soon as possible.
Another thing that, this is again just speculation, but Turkish Aerospace might be, sweetening the deal more by offering more offsets. So they might be saying things like, we'll let you, manufacture more of the jet, more of the electronics. And just like a couple of hours ago, I actually saw that the electronics company, Aselsan, opened an office in Indonesia as well. So maybe that's a step in that direction as well. So that could be a factor in pulling Indonesia from the KF-21 towards the KAAN, right?
Absolutely. And we know that Indonesia wants to develop their aerospace industry. In general, they want to develop their advanced and manufacturing industries domestically, tying in or securing a very good offset offer. And I don't know how much Turkey will typically provide in offsets. But that being said, just to give some context, Saab and the Swedish government, they've been offering offsets that go anywhere from 100% of the deal to 150% of the deal. So to put that into perspective, if you were a country, you sign like a $3 billion deal for Gripens, Saab or the Swedish government will invest anywhere from $3 billion to $4.5 billion back into your economy. And they will make a best effort, at least on paper, to target your most valued industries for investment. So that would include things like aerospace, manufacturing, that sort of thing, which could loop into both supporting your Gripen purchase through like transfer of technology, or potentially, support some other areas that can, that are adjacent. So in the case of Embraer, you could see like both offset investments going into, supporting the Gripen program there, but also in terms of buying the C390 transport aircraft, for example. So for Indonesia, securing a big offset from Turkey, especially when Turkey is perhaps the most willing to share and transfer technology, engage in collaboration, could be one of the main priorities. But at the same time, they were getting this from South Korea as well, and they didn't really seem to be receptive towards what South Korea was trying to do. So I think it's going to be worth watching in the coming years. So we'll now move towards the main discussion, which is about the Pakistan Navy. But Asim will be leaving to attend some personal commitments, so we thank him for his time on the episode. And we look forward to seeing him again next week. So in regards to the Pakistan Navy, so it'll be Arslan and I discussing it. So let's go into a bit of history about the Pakistan Navy. So historically, the Pakistan Navy had been neglected to a fault, especially when the geostrategic realities of Pakistan from the very beginning demanded a large navy. So, for example, when Bangladesh was in the Union as East Pakistan, Pakistan still maintained a relatively small navy, even though it had dispersed territories, both on the east and the west. However, there were some factors that probably constrained Pakistan from being able to rapidly develop a navy of that size. The first factor being that at the time of partition, Pakistan probably inherited relatively very little in the way of both naval infrastructure and naval personnel and capacity. Because remember, geographically, when this was one domain, the bulk of the British Indian Navy's forces were stationed within the core of India. So places like Pakistan, Bengal, these areas, Sindh and Bengal, they were like peripheries, basically, right? They were an extension of that Indian reach. So they did not require very significant naval infrastructure and investments to maintain, because that would be maintained through India. So once you split them out, then the areas which were the least developed from a naval standpoint were given to Pakistan. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is that, definitely the policy leadership in Pakistan through the 50s and 60s didn't really appreciate the importance of a navy. They took, things like transit routes from in and out of India and that sort of stuff for granted, evidently. The other side of it was that the navy, wasn't really seen as a critical factor in some of the security interests of the country. So for Pakistan, they're looking at Kashmir, right? They're not looking at like contesting naval interests with India or anything. So there's a lot of focus went into the army and the air force, whereas the navy was sort of put into the periphery, so to speak. However, since 1971, Pakistan Navy developed, number one, it got more appreciation for its, for its value and role, and that it needed to become more of a active defensive asset. But the other side of it was that the Navy itself understood that its main contribution to any conflict with India was to maintain a credible anti-access and area denial posture. To the point being that it needed to develop just enough capacity to prevent India from accessing Pakistan's coasts and littoral waters, and also to help defend Pakistan's sea lanes and economic interests at sea, both at peacetime and war. So this was a gradual development. I think they started off heavier on the aviation side through the 70s and 80s, through the induction of, for example, the Atlantic aircraft for anti-submarine warfare. They were able to lease a number of American frigates. Interestingly, those frigates, were also equipped with integrated anti-air warfare systems through the Standard 1 missile. So the Navy got quite a bit of a boost at the time in the 80s. Unfortunately, it had to return those frigates back to the US in the 90s, and then it replaced them with secondhand ex-Royal Navy frigates, so 6 Type 21s and 2 Leander class frigates from the UK. But I would argue that, at least from an anti-air warfare standpoint, these weren't as well equipped as the American frigates. So there was a bit of a downgrade happening through the 90s. However, at the same time, the Navy began to invest heavily in the submarine fleet. So it started off with the Augusta 90B project, which involved a relatively significant transfer of technology, not just in terms of assembling the submarine, but also some assistance from France in things like building some critical inputs. From my understanding, that also included steel, which the Navy has been now re-leveraging in different ways for its current projects. So a lot of things went where you could argue that through the 90s and early 2000s, a lot of foundation elements were being built. And then from 2015, that's when the foundation was activated and the Navy was given the green light to now modernize its fleet and then expand further. So the first big order that came down the pipeline was basically the order for 8 air-independent propulsion-equipped submarines from China, the S-26 with the Sterling AIP. So these are the Hungur class submarines. Right off the bat, these submarines, once inducted, probably by the end of this decade, would basically grow the Pakistan Navy's AIP-equipped submarine fleet to 11 boats, which is relatively large. And then the second component, the big one, was the expansion of the surface fleet. So I believe that the submarine deal with China also included the 4 Type 054 AP frigates, which are the Turkish class frigates. And then shortly after that, in 2018, 2019, the Navy signed the deal for the 4 Miljam Barber class corvettes. Shortly before that, it signed a deal with Daman Shipyards for 2 offshore patrol vessels with an option for 2 more. And then it basically concluded the first phase of the procurement effort by committing to 10 new long-range maritime patrol aircraft based on the Embraer Lineage 1000. So the first batch are being configured for that role as we speak. And there's still more to come. So essentially, there's a lot of stuff happening in the Navy, and it's become a bit of a silent success story in its own right. You know, again, it's a smaller power compared to the Indian Navy for sure, but I would say just relative to the resources the Pakistan Navy has, it truly is punching well above its weight, and we're starting to see, you know, a level of growth. Like, think about the surface fleet. They had through the 90s and thousands about 8 frigates, right? They were very under-equipped for the threat environment. And now they're at the cusp of having a total of 20 frigates, right, by the end of this decade. Or let's say 20 large surface vessels of different kinds, including around 12 to 16 frigates or frigate-sized vessels, right, with fully integrated anti-air, anti-submarine, and anti-surface warfare capabilities. And these are like brand new ships. They're not secondhand ships, right? Whereas the ships that the Navy would traditionally operate were secondhand. So it's such a big leap from both a numbers and quality standpoint with such a very small, very constrained budget, relatively speaking. And that's why we made a note earlier that as the surface fleet and as the submarine fleets and as the aviation fleets grow, the Navy's fixed budget will start increasing. So it will logically start demanding a bigger share of the defense budget in the long run to be able to support all this equipment. So yeah, Arslan, what do you think? And yeah, we can also then go into the Navy's focus on original projects as well.
Yeah, so effectively, as you mentioned, we've seen a significant growth in the Navy and their programs. And I think one thing you maybe forgot to mention was also the induction or the co-development with Swift ships of 20 plus gunboats. So the surface fleet and also the subsurface fleet is getting a massive expansion. We know this was from an interview with a naval officer during the launching or some deep dive tests of the final Augusta class submarine that was built in Pakistan, and they let us know already back then that they had a requirement for 18 submarines, 18 conventional submarines, which is clearly the requirement that they're looking to fulfill. And in fact, from what we can tell, the trajectory they're going on, it's looking like they're going to far surpass that number. They're not planning on stopping at 18. It looks like it's going to be something far greater. And this is where we can tie it into our focus on the Navy's original projects versus off-the-shelf projects. So if we go back down into the current main project, so we'll start off with the Sea Sultan, the long-range maritime patrol aircraft. So the situation with that is the Navy put out a tender looking for a new modern maritime patrol aircraft. In this case, they selected the Lineage 1E, which is a bizjet version of the E190, the Embraer 190. You know, it's got extended fuel tanks and all this kind of stuff, extended range fuel tanks. So we've seen this. It's a system that combines a lot of commercial off-the-shelf inputs, like Westcam's MX-20 EOIR, which is the same system done on the P8, Leonardo's Sea Spray 7500 EV2. So these are all systems that are already prepared, already available off the market, accessible to the Navy. And it combines them and integrates them into a platform that is ITAR free. And also on top of that, we see, this program is a combination of the sort of the off the shelf and the sort of original aspect, right? Because we saw that the Navy wanted a rotating bomb bay, for example. Whether that's something that actually makes it into the final design or not is to be seen. But the aspirations seemingly are quite large, and we can see this is also a program that's going quite well. So we've had 3 aircraft delivered. 2 were delivered to Paramount Group. 2 were delivered to Paramount Group, based out in Wonderboom, South Africa. 1 was delivered to the Navy. It's currently being used as a training aircraft and VIP transport, which makes sense. And then we've also just had 1 new aircraft contracted. And ironically, this was an aircraft this aircraft was delivered to the British, to a UK-based operator. And later on in its life, it found itself, ironically, in the hands of an Indian operator. It was registered as Victor Tango Alpha Oscar Papa. And then later, in its current stage, it was registered November 9 with a US-based operator before it's transferred to the Pakistan Navy. This aircraft will be delivered to Paramount to begin its conversion, which probably indicates to us that at least the first 1 or 2 aircraft are ready for delivery to the end user, i.e. the Pakistan Navy. Beyond this, I believe, Bilal, you could probably tell us more about the other original projects like NRDI's SOSUS or their energy-based,
For sure. But before I get there, I really want to make a couple interesting points on the Sea Sultan. So one thing is that you'll notice that it is very much, in a weird way, OEM independent. And what we mean by that is that, yes, the work is being done without Embraer's input, which is one aspect. But the other thing is that whenever the Navy would need, let's say the Navy decides after the initial 10 aircraft, it wants to add another 2, 3, 4, 6, whatever the number is. For them, the process is basically to go and find some secondhand aircraft. And it doesn't have to be the lineage. It could be the 1E that it was based off of. It just needs some additional work for the fuel cells. But they need to acquire that aircraft and then basically find a contractor, whether it's Paramount Group or someone else. For example, you have, like, I think Rhineland Air Services in Germany and others in the UK who can just carry out the integration work. Because the integration work, or the blueprint for the integration work, has already been defined. It's owned by the Navy. So the Navy has this amazing flexibility now that it's not tied to, let's say, Lockheed or Boeing in order to get that next, let's say, God forbid, it just loses one for whatever reason, right? They can replace that fairly readily, right? Yes, it'll take some time to get the pieces together and reintegrate and build a new unit. But the point being is that they're not beholden to an OEM who can just decide to shut down the factory one day. So that's one very, I think, critical gain that they got out of this original project approach, where even if they cannot build an aircraft, right, and there's no aerospace industry in Pakistan, so to speak, to do that, they can still get these advanced solutions by leveraging literally what's already available off the shelf and putting it together.
One thing to also add to this is we saw that the Navy, well, maybe we haven't seen, but we know quite recently that the Navy is looking at setting up a depot level MRO facility. And so for those who don't know what this means, it's basically a very, very high level of maintenance and repair overhaul. So this facility would be able to cover major repair, overhaul, or even complete rebuilds of components, engines, parts, and sub-assemblies and assemblies. It also would include possibly the manufacturing of parts, technical assistance to potentially, it's something that the Navy could look at, is providing technical assistance to other operators even, for example. But effectively, it's a very, very deep level of maintenance, repair, overhaul, a facility being built by the Navy for their own use.
And who knows, it might evolve further to take on the integration work domestically. So, they could be potentially working with Paramount Group and Leonardo to transfer the know-how and the capacity to do this in Pakistan in the future. So that gives them, not just with this platform, but just the general idea of, you can task an RDI to find some other platform to try out for some different applications, right? For example, maybe a smaller jet platform for more of a purely reconnaissance role. And then they can take on that task, or maybe another one for, let's say, an electronic warfare role. And they can go on and take on that task domestically by using this sort of facility. It is interesting that this is being done independently of PAC. So now we suddenly have this other aircraft support vendor emerging in Pakistan through the Navy. Yeah. So before we move any further towards the new projects, I do want to just quickly touch on one of the Navy's existing ones. So the F-22P frigate, it was amongst the first net new warships the Pakistan Navy procured in the late 2000s and inducted in the early 2010s. Now it is reaching, 15 to 20 years of age. And as a result, the Navy has earmarked it for a midlife upgrade. So Arslan, do you have any comments on what this upgrade could entail?
Yeah, so so we've seen a very similar upgrade to a very similar ship. So the 053 frigate, which is in operation with the Royal Thai Navy, known locally as the Narrowsing class frigate. This was the F-22P is based off of the 053H3, which is another sister ship of the 053 with a different superstructure. So this is so the Royal Thai Navy did a really comprehensive midlife update of their ships from the fire suppression systems, which was a key area of deficiency they identified, but also beyond that they did a really comprehensive overhaul, including fully Western electronics. You've got Saab Sea Giraffes, you've got Thales's LW08 long range search radar, you've got Raytheon nav radars, Italian IFF, Saab Swedish combat management systems, and all this kind of stuff, even German sonars. And this is all packed onto the Chinese hull. And this is the great thing about naval vessels, right? Is it's not as limited as an aircraft, right? You don't have to worry about, so you don't necessarily have to worry about size and weight and constraints as much as you do in an aircraft. So what they did is they've gone and effectively got it and replaced everything as much as they could with Western systems. So you've replaced the original main gun with a Mark 45 Mod 2. Also, they've also managed to fit a 8-cell Mark 41 VLS in there, which gives them the capability of firing 32 ESSMs, or Evolved Sea Sparrow missiles, alongside harpoons via slant launchers, and also American torpedoes. So this is so we'll probably see something quite similar with the Pakistani F-22P as well. And we know what they're looking for, right? We know that the PN has effectively gone all in on CAM ER. We see this present on the Diamond ships, We see this present on the Jinnah and Babur class, and we also see the Pakistan Navy looking to procure surface-based batteries as well of CAM ER from Italy to protect coastal installations and naval bases. This is also another, in terms of the F-22P MLU, we've also seen that they're looking at they're doing studies for the integration of CAM ER into the F-22P. So we'll probably see something like that. We'll probably see another variation of Aselsan's Smart S Mk2 being used here. We'll probably see, so it will probably be quite similar to the other ships in service, right? We'll effectively probably see the Advent combat management system and whatnot. Effectively, what I'm predicting and guessing for these ships is a downgraded, sort of lesser capable fit of the Babur class's systems and weapons, purely integrated onto the ship, based around the CAM ER and potentially the same anti-ship solution they've gone for there, whether that's Smash, whether that's Harba, or Tamur, or whatever it may be.
Interesting. I mean, even though it would be a bit of a downgrade compared to the Barber class, it would just still be a significant upgrade
A
and
massive upgrade.
provide a much better level of interoperability and integration with the
Yeah.
other surface ships as well. So then moving on to the future. So I mean, a couple of things. So about 4 to 5 years ago, the Navy chief, the retiring Navy chief, had revealed that the Pakistan Navy was working on 3 notably important projects. We did not hear much about. So let's move on to some of the Pakistan Navy's new programs, such as its SOSUS, its high energy laser based directed energy weapon, and its hypersonic anti-ship ballistic missile. So Arsan, what do you think?
Yeah, so firstly, I'd like to just touch on what SOSUS even is, right? For those who may not know, is effectively, imagine you've got a network of hydrophones, or a network of microphones or whatever under the water, fixed in place, always listening, right? So think of it as a sort of early warning, early detection capability of adversary submarines. And these will be dotted all across our coastline, further out, deeper in the waters, to be able to give our crews, our anti-submarine warfare crews and whatnot, an early warning capability. Okay, look, let them know, okay, look, there's something over here. It might be, within like a 10, 20 mile radius. What it does is it will allow these crews to really focus in on a key area, enabling them to detect whatever may be needed. Because otherwise, without such a system, you're effectively looking for a needle in a haystack, right? You're dumping sonar buoys here and there and everywhere, looking for a trace, looking for something to listen to, and looking for an area to home into. Whereas with something like a SOSUS network, you've had the biggest issue narrowed down, right? You've got a narrowed down search area, and what that allows us to do is really look in this area where we know there was a last seen trace, a last heard trace of a submarine or whatever, and really improve our chances of interception. So I'll hand it back over to you now to further discuss the actual implementation and also the history behind it in the Navy.
Yeah, so we knew that in general the Pakistan Navy required a SOSUS, but the first time it was directly mentioned as both a requirement and something that was being developed or implemented in progress was in about 2020 or 2021, where the then Navy chief, he was retiring. He basically had a very comprehensive speech detailing the Pakistan Navy's upcoming procurement and development programs. And he very explicitly called out the SOSUS as one of the landmark initiatives. And then and the main application here, as our son basically alluded to, is it's to essentially provide you with an early warning sensor network, so to speak, to be able to identify and track enemy submarines. You're aware that the Indian Navy has a very large submarine program in its own right. It wants to leverage that capability. So by developing the SOSUS network within your own waters, you have developed a capacity to be able to potentially detect and then kick off your anti-submarine warfare mechanisms in a much more focused and efficient manner. So now you put all these pieces together. You have your SOSUS network in the waters, and then you have this growing fleet of anti-submarine warfare capable ships, from the F-22P, the Bomber class corvettes, to the Jinnah class frigates. And then in the air, you have fast-moving Sea Sultan long-range maritime patrol aircraft. You also have some P-3Cs kicking around. You might even have additional assets as well, like a future helicopter and maybe possibly even smaller jet-based maritime surveillance aircraft as well coming down the line in the future. So all these assets can now be used much more efficiently with a SOSUS, right? So once you detect like some anomaly, you don't have to send everybody in to go and check it out. You can send your fast-moving aircraft in first, and you can have a couple of frigates or corvettes to then investigate. And maybe down the line in the future, you might even send things like autonomous vessels to check the threat out as well. So it gives the Navy a very high degree of situational awareness and response capability. And again, look, they're not thinking of things in isolation. They are and have been quietly building a very robust anti-access and area denial system using the things they have available to them. So when you start looking beyond just the individual platforms in like a very focused, itemized way and look at the overall picture, you start seeing that the Navy is really working on some very interesting things. And this is again 4 to 5 years ago, announced that they were working on a high energy laser-based directed energy weapon. So I think again that's very interesting from a implementation standpoint, because this is all these announcements, they predate the current conflict by a few years. So the Navy seems to have had some awareness of both like high speed munition threats that could necessitate this kind of and also the risk of drones, for example. What are your thoughts on that, Hassan?
Yeah, potentially. As we mentioned before, the Navy is quite a forward-looking force. I don't necessarily think in its current form, directed energy weapon will probably be useful as a close-in weapon system. I think for the foreseeable future, the Navy will continue to invest in potentially even missile-based close-in systems. However, the key area where I think this directed energy weapon stuff will come in handy is shipborne drone defense, right? Because that's the biggest problem of the current era, right? Is these pesky little drones with low RCS. You don't want to waste, cams or HQ-16s on them. They're perfectly capable of being destroyed with a high energy laser. And I think that's where that's really going to focus in on, particularly as a first development as well.
I agree. And then finally, in terms of forward-looking systems, they had also announced the development of the P-282 hypersonic anti-ship ballistic missile. So what's significant about this, and obviously, fairly recently they test-fired the SMASH missile, which is basically the supersonic anti-ship ballistic missile. But what's interesting about the P-282 is that, again, it predates the conflict. And there was an awareness that the armed forces would need to invest in some sort of hypersonic application eventually. But with ASBMs, I believe this sort of project, even SMASH, from my understanding, it involved NESCOM in the development process. So NESCOM, wherever it's developing for the Navy's hypersonic needs, that same kind of missile will eventually show up for the Army and the Air Force as well. So again, the fact that it was the Navy that announced this sort of program and made it a priority years before this conflict, again, really speaks to their awareness. And I keep harping about it, but it's very important, because when you have this very long-term and accurate awareness of what's happening of the future, right? That's where you're going to steer your investments towards, right? And especially when you have such limited resources compared to the Army, for example, every dollar counts, right? So with the Navy, they just really made some excellent calls such a long time ago. And now these programs, which were designed for the Navy, especially the directed energy weapon and the ASBM, these programs will be adopted by the other tri-services forces as well.
Yeah, so also another thing we should probably touch on is the fact that the Navy is also seemingly mirroring the Air Force's strategy of, network-centric warfare, right? We've got Link Green, we've got the implementation of Link 17, all these kind of networked assets. But also the bigger aspect of Sea Sultan is, it's a maritime patrol aircraft first, but secondarily also, they've got a focus on airborne early warning. And as you know, and as we know, the Navy has been trying to get its own airborne early warning aircraft for years. We had the P2s, we had P3s with radars from the E2C. The Navy has been doing everything it can.
Yeah, they actually got approval from the US to buy that So it's basically they're supposed to use 3 P3Bs equipped with the Hawkeye 2000.
Yeah, so we know that the Navy is really looking to go all in on these on the sensor network as well, and beyond that, they've also invested heavily in drones as well to be able to implement that over the horizon network, sensor network. So in terms of stuff like Smash and all these kinds. So another thing about Smash, right, is we know it's effectively a navalized P282. We've got not P282,
Fatah.
Fatah 2. So we know it's effectively a navalized, modified Fatah 2 for the Navy, and as part of these long-range anti-ship ballistic missiles, you really need to build up that sensor network to be able to provide that continuous mid-course guidance and whatnot. Because these ships move, they move quite fast as well in some cases. So you really need to be able to provide that targeting data at these extreme ranges, and you're not going to do that via shipborne sensors. You're going to do that via space, via the air, and that's where these systems like Sea Sultan and these drones come into play.
Yeah. So the next original project is the Jinnah class frigate. It's a result of the Miljam Barber class corvette program that was signed back in 2018. Under the deal, the Turkish OEM Asfat basically agreed to help NRDI, the Pakistan Navy's in-house design bureau, develop an original frigate for the Pakistan Navy. We've seen some initial designs of the Jinnah class frigate. It's also called the AS3400 by Asfat. Very standard configuration, not too far from what we see from the Barber class. What are your thoughts on that, Aslan?
Yeah, so it seems like quite a safe play from what we can tell, right? There's nothing groundbreaking, but it's an upgrade. There's no denying it. And as one of the real key things you mentioned is the configuration is just not frozen. So at this moment in time, as things develop, as more options become available, we could potentially see it become. Right now, the biggest limitation is the lack of a VLS system that works for us. Because the Jinnah has been designed based off of the Barber class as hull, you're still suffering with the same space constraints and limitations. And this is where the GWS 26 VLS system comes into play, because it's a really compact system. It doesn't take up a bunch of space. It's literally a tube, effectively probably the same size, maybe just slightly bigger than a KAAN missile. So it works quite well in that sense, it's saving space. But as things become more available, as our partners like Turkey and China or whoever it may be come up with their own solutions, potentially we could even see a Turkish VLS housing KAAN missiles for the PN. And these are all things. So nothing is fixed in place. Everything can change. We've seen that the surface-to-surface missile configuration has changed a million times. In fact, if you go just slightly back, with the Daman ships, we saw like 4 different versions of the same 2 ships in different promotional material. We'd seen one with Ram, we'd seen one with Gokdeniz, we'd seen everything under the sun. So things are still due to change. But other than that, it seems like quite a safe bet from the Pakistan Navy. They're taking systems that have existed, that have worked. And this is the key thing, right, is we know the Pakistan Navy isn't typically a risk taker. They prefer solutions and systems that have already been in use, that have been proven. So, we're still seeing, as of right now, we're still seeing them stick to, Smart S, MK2, and you're replacing some Turkish systems with local ones. Like, we're replacing the Ares 2N ESM system with the local GIDS Ribat system. So things will change. Things are due to change, but it seems like quite a safe bet. And we also potentially see some growth potential in the design, right? Because Asfat has not only revealed the AS30, but they've also revealed the AS3600, which is a larger system, a larger ship, far more weapons, a different sensor fit, more anti-ship missiles, larger VLS magazine. They also use a missile-based point defense system. So things can change, but as of right now, it seems like the Navy is playing it quite safe. Potentially what we could also see is a batched procurement like we saw with the Diamond frigates. So, we see, maybe 2 in its original configuration or 4 in its original configuration, whatever, then a flight to larger, further developed based on the lessons of the first batch.
I agree. And just to build on that, this is a long-term initiative, right? The whole purpose of designing an original frigate platform is to not just get a ship and roll it out. It's more in terms of building the internal capacity to be able to design original solutions whenever the Navy requires them. So they've been doing this both at the high end with the frigate, which is like the larger design, and also at the small end with that Swift Ships collaboration for the small patrol boats. So they're trying to build that capacity from, anywhere from 40 meters up to like 110 meters in length, which is a very comprehensive approach, which I think will really start paying off in a few years when we start hearing of more original NRDI designs for different requirements. I think in the near term, we should start hearing about NRDI designed, for example, unmanned surface vessels, for example, or fast attack crafts. That's really the first original applications, and areas the Navy hasn't really bought anything from the market yet, but it will require down the line. And plus,
Yeah.
also the subsystems are also evolving. So, for example, whatever limitations we have in terms of vertical launch systems today won't be the case in 5 to 10 years because there'll be more options.
And also,
so now,
the sorts of numbers we're procuring, potentially 8 ships is not a small figure. And based off of the Pakistan Navy's current procurement pipeline, it's very likely that these orders are going to be dragged out significantly. It's not going to be something where we're seeing, 8 ships in 20 years. We might see 8, within 20, 30 years even, because the Navy is, and we're going to touch on this quite soon, is there are far more pressing needs and far bigger programs in the works, specifically subsurface stuff. Whether we see a first batch of 1 or 2 frigates, that's fine, but I don't think that's going to be the final iteration of the Jinnah class frigate. And potentially we might even see help from other OEMs like Daman, who's just recently signed up for the Pakistan Navy's own initiative of, own NASTIP-like initiative. So there's so much growth potential. There's so much room for improvement. So we see all the, guys, it's not the be all and end all. Don't sit there sulking that you've only got 16, VLS. No, again, this is a very first initial iteration. I truly think that there will be a further development, a far larger ship, far more capable ship with more weapons and more sensors and whatnot.
I agree. So now moving towards the subsurface. So one of the Navy's most high profile and least spoken about programs, which is interesting because it really speaks to the Pakistan Navy's subsurface unit, which is the silent service, as we call them, is the shallow water attack submarines, or SWATs. So this has been a program that has been in the works since at least 2016. The Navy's been very quiet about it, except one time in a Facebook post, it basically revealed that these were going to be inducted soon. So now the thing is, because we're talking about the silent service, they're very secretive about what this could be. However, there may be some indications. And again, now just to preface, this is not hard-coded information. We're just analyzing the situation what we see based on the information available. We are not saying A OEM or B OEM or C OEM have won the contract definitively or are going to win a certain contract. We are just explaining what is
purely
happening.
Our opinion, purely our view based off of what we can see in front of us.
Exactly, right? We're just explaining this from an analytical standpoint. We're making inferences, we're connecting dots. We're looking at the dots available and trying to make a line, right? The line may not be straight all the time. That's the issue because we don't have all the information. But again, just to preface that. So with the shallow water attack submarine program, we know for a fact that I would say 2 major OEMs were competing for it. The first one, or maybe 3. So basically three OEMs from 2 different countries. So from Turkey, we had STM proposing its STM 500. Shallow water attack submarine. I believe the first of these is under construction for the Turkish Navy already. And then the second and third OEMs came from Italy. So the first one was Fincantieri and the other one was Draz. Basically, the 2 were evaluated at different points. Basically proposed their S800 platform to the Pakistan Navy, whereas Draz had a number of different shallow water attack concepts, but none of those, it was unclear to what extent they could, manufacture those. So it seemed that they were sort of pushed to the side a bit, and really the competition was boiling down between Fincantieri and STM. So potentially, again, not definitively, potentially one of these 2 OEMs had won the shallow water attack submarine program. And I do believe, and this is just my opinion, is based on what the Pakistan Navy had said at different points. I believe the shallow water attack submarine program was finalized, the contract was inked, and something is being produced for the Pakistan Navy. We might not even hear of an induction until years after it's inducted, because this is to understand the Pakistan Navy's submarine force in general is supposed to be secretive. They're referred to as the silent service, right? So now within that group, you have another subgroup of the shallow water attack submarine. The submarine by design is meant to be tied into special operations, is meant to be tied into, basically to be a quiet threat, a quiet defensive threat that the enemy should have very minimal awareness about. We might not even hear about the induction of this submarines until 1 to 2 years after it's been delivered and inducted within the Pakistan Navy. And it might just be a passing mention. So we might never even know who the actual OEM is, because again, this submarine is, you could say I don't want to say the last line of defense, but it's really meant to be the trump card. It's meant to spring a surprise.
That's you can potentially make a reasonably educated guess, but I think we'll leave that one for later after we discuss both options.
That being said, I was told at Ideas at one point by people who were okay with the information coming out. That for the shallow water attack submarine, the Pakistan Navy was looking for something in the design in the range of about 500 to 800 tons displacement. It needed to have an air independent propulsion system. They were very interested in fuel cells because there was minimal moving parts. They didn't care for speed. They wanted stealth over speed. Very stripped down in the sense that, you know, it's not meant to do like distant land attack missions. It's really meant to be like a anti-sub, anti-ship asset. So it should have the ability to deploy heavyweight torpedoes. Definitely the ability to deploy SDVs or swimmer dive vehicles for, you know, SSGN units. And basically, and I believe in an electronic support measure system for electronic intelligence. So again, a very intelligence-driven special forces / trump card sort of platform. Again, with numbers, we won't know. That was never revealed. It could be anywhere from 2 to like, who knows, right? But
Yeah.
I do believe that there was a sense that the Pakistan Navy did, and this is from like a secondary source, so not Navy, not OEM, but from someone who's pretty reliable. Like they reliably told me about, for example, the VT4 Heather program before it took off, right? They reliably told me that the T129 was selected back in 2016, all this kind of stuff. So what they said was that there wasn't an ambition to manufacture these submarines in Pakistan under license as well. So that's what the SWATs program is at. Again, I would say the top 2 OEMs competing for it were probably Fincantieri and STM, but who knows? That might have been a feint, and there's a third OEM we don't even know about.
Yeah, potentially. I mean, with Dearsan unveiled a similar design.
Yeah, Dearsan, yep.
But as you said, I think this is very much a 2 OEM tender, and potentially one of them may have taken the.
Yep. Now the more interesting thing about the SWATs program was that, if you notice with the Pakistan Navy, they have this ambition to become a submarine building navy. And this statement was made after the Augusta 90B program, meaning that the Augusta program was not enough. And even the Hungor program is not enough to get there. So what is enough? Well, like you look at the aviation and surface side of the equation. So on the aviation side, the Navy has an original maritime patrol aircraft now, the Sea Sultan. On the surface ship side, it has an original frigate in the works, the Jinnah class frigate, and it even has an original patrol boat being developed in collaboration with Swift ships, or being built rather in collaboration with Swift ships. So what that means is that their eventual ambition is to have an original submarine of their own, right? Something that they can call it, something that's their own, an original design, a next generation platform that will help bring the submarine fleet all the way up to that 18 boat goal. So now that 18 boat goal, we have to remember that it includes the 8 Hungor class submarines for sure, and it also includes the 5 Augustas that we have right now. But the Augustas are going to age. So, for example, the Augusta 70s are from the 70s and 80s. They're about to get they're going to need retiring soon. It's possible that the SWATs was slotted in specifically to start replacing them, at least in certain role, and maybe even as a training submarine. So maybe we might hear of one of the SWATs becoming a training submarine, for example. Maybe then the Augusta 90s. You know, they were inducted through the late 90s, early 2000s, you know, by 2030, 2040, especially with the lack of OEM support from Naval Group, formerly DCNS. You know, these might be slotted in for retirement through the 2030s or at most by 2040. So this next gen submarine that's going to be pursued would basically be there to replace these ones and then take the Pakistan Navy fleet up to that 18 boat goal. So we're talking about a pretty big order segment, you know, not including the SWAT. So if you include SWATs, let's say they for hypothetics, you know, hypothetically they have 4 submarines there. You have the 8 Hungors. So you have a potential procurement roadmap for about 6 new generation submarines. And this is where it gets interesting because the OEM that wins the SWATs contract, especially if there's like a local license production element, would ostensibly be like, you know, as we saw with Asfat Group with the Miljam Corvette program, could be the main partner for developing this next gen submarine. So Arslan, in terms of that next generation submarine requirement, I think you have some thoughts.
Yeah, so as we discussed earlier, whoever effectively gets this shallow water attack submarine contract will probably take the contract for the Pakistan Navy's next generation attack submarine. Those submarines are probably designed to replace the Augusta fleet fully, so it's not going to be like a submarine procured in large numbers like Hangul, because these are going to be very expensive, very top of the line submarines. You know, the U212 NFS is a submarine. The first 2 units are looking at costing, I think, the program cost for the first 2 units is either 1.5 billion for the two units or 1.5 billion per unit, including the research and development cost. After that, the price drops down to about 500 million a unit, which is still not cheap. Realistically, as with defense projects, these costs balloon. So it's a very much a crown jewel. It's the submarine of the fleet. So it's not something that's going to likely be procured in large numbers, but we know it's something potentially on offer to the Pakistan Navy. And on the other hand, we've got the STM 500. And with that, we had the STM's submarine on offer as well. However, there was a sort of a demerit to it would have probably been the fact that it was an export designed boat. It was not a boat that the Turkish Navy were looking to induct themselves. And that raises questions about support and life cycle, right? With the U212 NFS, the OEM the host country will be using it. Italy will be using it for decades to come. That gives you a sort of assured and guaranteed line of support later down the line, in 10, 20 years, that the OEM will still be interested because the government has a vested interest in keeping them interested. With something like the TS 1700 from STM, there is nothing saying that, 10, 20 years down the line, STM doesn't have their heads turned by another project that has lost complete interest in the Pakistan Navy project. So that's sort of me touching on that. But if possible, you could potentially go more into where they fit in terms of the Pakistan Navy and also the future submarine roadmap and how that fits into the Pakistan Navy's long-term plans.
Yeah, for sure. So, one thing we have to recognize with the Type 212 or U212 is that it is a NATO design. So there's going to be a lot of technology and a lot of inputs that will simply not be released to Pakistan by virtue of the fact that there's critical NATO inputs in there. And those will also likely be the main cost drivers to that submarine. So for the Pakistan Navy, it's more in terms of give us the platform that has been tested and validated, and then let's customize it for our needs in relation to the fiscal constraints that we have. So for example, when you look at, say, the Type 212, you might end up with a situation where, yes, Fincantieri will develop a cross variation, drawing on maybe the same propulsion, a similar fuel cell stack, and some other common inputs, but then develop a toned down export version for the Pakistan Navy that could be a bit more similar to the Type 214, which was in the original 212 program, the Type 214 was the export variant of the 212. So that might involve, for example, sourcing a different steel supplier as opposed to the one that, the Italian Navy is using, so to ensure that there's no risk of secrets spilling in terms of the nature of the steel, for example. It could involve maybe finding a different OEM, right, for the lithium ion inputs. So there are these little things that could, not little, but there are these specific things that would probably be done. Because again, now you might say, well, there's a lot of customization going on, but that's the point. This is meant to be the Pakistan Navy's original submarine program, right? So it's meant to be something that Pakistan would, relatively speaking, own a significant share of, right? And even provide some of the key inputs for domestically. I know, for example, there's been a really strong push in Pakistan to try to basically develop ship-grade steel. I believe it was public steel mills. They said that they were capable of doing it. So if that's the case, then the Pakistan Navy wants to leverage this asset and provide them those orders so that they can provide the necessary steel for a program like this. Now, obviously, we're talking about non-magnetic steel here, so that's a different category. But the fact is that the Navy submarine needs are perpetual. They're going to constantly come. Even with these ones in 50 years, you're going to replace those ones, right? It's a constant cycle. So you're going to need this technology regardless. So investing in it is not, it's not a dead end, right? It'll constantly be reused. So the point being is that this OEM is going to come in and use a foundation that works, supported, and then swap out the stuff that it cannot sell you, but give you something that it fits with your requirements and your budget, basically.
Yeah. And also, it's really important that because this tender likely will decide the future of the Pakistan Navy's original programs, including the nuclear submarine program, which is something we'll touch on later. This is quite an important tender and an important contract, because whoever this goes to will effectively have a hand in any future potential nuclear submarine development as well. Again, this is all potential, this is all hypotheticals. Any news outlets who want to cover that, this is all hypothetical, our opinion. So potentially what we think, you could discuss and explain who we think has received the contract and also what this means for the future of the Pakistan Navy.
Yeah, so there's some indications that you can point to, but again, it's not definitive, right? But there's some signs that you could point to. Again, speculation, not definitive. The big one is the Pakistan Navy Maritime Science and Technology Park, which is basically their equivalent of NASTAP. So I presume that a lot of naval industry development will start being pushed through this entity. And this entity has been pretty much opened up for investment from foreign OEMs. So far, 2 OEMs have invested within the PN Technology Park.
Yeah.
One is Diamond Shipyards. So that's the supplier of the OPVs.
Yeah.
And that's interesting as well. Again, that's interesting as well. That could
Yeah.
also point towards a future in terms of original ship design
collaboration.
as well,
and
right?
that's what
Like,
I think that will turn towards, is potentially some joint development work on the Jinnah class, or
and there's
some other.
Yeah, there's so many other applications. Like you have like,
But also the shipyard angle as well. It's potentially we could see Diamond setting up another shipyard in Gwadar like the Pakistan Navy's wanted, and using it as their regional MRO, which we've seen some indication of as well, right?
Yep, exactly. Pakistan Navy has been, from what I understand, open to investing or letting investment come into Gwadar shipyard. On the other side is the Pakistan Navy has other requirements as well. They have like their additional auxiliary ships, additional logistics ships. They needed a submarine rescue ship. I mean, you have like a massive submarine fleet planned. Right? So these are all these things that Daman can definitely contribute towards, right? With their expertise. And then on the other end, and plus Daman's really good with like working with third-party suppliers and networks. Like that's how they've built themselves, right? So they know this inside out. And the other investor, and this is interesting, it's Fincantieri. So now what's the trend with these investors? Well, these investors so far have Navy projects, right? Daman has OPVs with the Pakistan Navy. 4 right now, potentially 4 more in the future, because the Navy said it was looking for up to 8 OPVs. Right. And then Fincantieri, they didn't like. What are they doing there?
There's no requirement for the Pakistan Navy for the kind of ships that Fincantieri offers, except the 2 that the Pakistan Navy wants. So go on.
Yeah, so that's where you get into this interesting territory. And again, and
speculation.
The other side of it is, look, it's speculation, but I also know there's that sense that, well, what if India comes in and tries to pressure it? At the end of the day, there's a finite number of contracts the Indian government can support. Right. And Pakistan, as we kind of touched upon at the very beginning, is a multi-billion-dollar arms procurer. Right. And from 2020 to 2025, SIPRI, the Stockholm Institute of Peace Research, they basically inferred, based on the data that was available, that Pakistan was in the top 5 arms importers from 2020 to 2025. Top 5. Right. So there are these periods where Pakistan does become a major arms import or major arms procurer. And we know what was startling about that figure for everyone in the industry. More than half of that valuation went straight to China.
And also,
unless you're in the Pakistan conversation, you're going to lose big contracts to China for no reason, right? And then it's not to disrespect the Chinese. Like, we know the Chinese are a reliable supplier, but we're talking from an industry standpoint here, that you are a business development leader in Europe, Turkey, America even, right? You have shareholders you need to answer to,
You are handing over free contracts to the Chinese uncontested.
Exactly.
And that's a significant market. And also the Pakistan Navy is reasonably, as you mentioned, the good boy on the block. They've never had any issues. And they are, and OEMs and also other countries are reasonably open to, in terms of export controls or whatnot as well. So it's a relatively open market. And we also know the Pakistan Navy doesn't have that sort of culture that the other branches have. It's a relatively easier place to do business as well. Wink, wink.
Yep. And the Pakistan Navy, in relation to the good boy narrative, is that they work very extensively internationally. So they want to get involved in multinational coalitions. They want to get involved in peacetime sea security, maritime security. So the reality of the Pakistan Navy in particular is that people within the U.S. Navy know them, right? People within the Canadian Navy know them. People within the Royal Navy, all these key defense actors in the world know who the Pakistan Navy is, and they have a pretty good approximation of what's going to be kept conventional and what will be kept strategic. Because the thing is, yes, in a very broad meta macro level sense, whatever knowledge and expertise the Pakistan Navy would develop or NRDI would develop through the original submarine program would potentially be leveraged for a future nuclear submarine program. But we're talking about very high level abstractive knowledge here, right? We're talking about things like knowing how to manage manufacturing networks. We're talking about things like knowing how to manage, your steel OEMs and stuff. We're talking about things that, are by nature both conventional and nuclear in nature. You cannot prevent being from flowing horizontally. But the thing about the Navy is that they're very clear on what's going to be strategic and what's going to be conventional. And right now, with the exception of some one-off statements really about the role of the Bomber 3 cruise missile, right? They really want to keep their submarines in a conventional role, right? They understand that these submarines are not going to be the most threatening strategic nuclear assets, right? I mean, number one, at most they're going to carry at best in an emergency situation, tactical warhead. They cannot,
Yeah.
they're not equipped to carry ballistic missiles or anything.
Yeah.
So for the Navy, the ROI on this is like what? Like you hit 1-2 strikes and your submarine gets exposed, and that's it. That's the end of it. Or you use the submarines for the work, for the design, or for the goal that they were designed for, which is to take out enemy ships and other enemy submarines. So that's where this next generation submarine is going to be used for. It's not going to be this VLS equipped monster.
Yeah.
It's going to be a really tightened down, straightforward, heavyweight torpedo deployment asset, basically.
Yeah.
And its goal is to be stealthy and quiet. That's it. Like stealth, and maybe to an extent some speed, but mostly stealth and just be quiet and just deter through presence.
Yeah.
Right? The Indian Navy should know that from the Pakistan Navy's standpoint, the message it wants to send to the Indian Navy is that, look, you do not want to enter these waters. You don't even want to get close to these waters. Because you're going to deal with a threat that no one else has dealt with at any level. You're going to deal with a proper, well-provisioned defensive navy, both subsurface or throughout subsurface, surface, and aviation. So there's no point in trying to impose your presence here. Like what you did in 71 is not going to happen. And that's it. And that's like the 80%. Now we get into the 20%, which is the strategic side, which goes into not so much the Navy's role as a strategic power, like not power projection, but more in terms of second strike, right? So this goes more into the Pakistan's broader strategic, goals, basically. So yes, we'll be clear here, because I think there's been a bit of back and forth, and people are not too sure sometimes, or maybe too sure. But yes, the Pakistan Navy has been seeking a nuclear-powered submarine. Like this has been documented pretty well over the years.
It's as clear as day.
It's just very exceptionally difficult to pull off. Right. It is exceptionally difficult to do. You're not just talking about, yes, now, unlike other areas like aerospace, Pakistan does have somewhat of a foundation for this through the nuclear program, because the nuclear program necessitated the development and production of indigenous nuclear reactors. So we have a scientific R&D base that knows how to build nuclear reactors. The problem is that they're cut off from literally everyone. Right? They cannot access the same tool. Again, they don't have the access to the same scientific support that India does by virtue of being part of the nuclear suppliers group. So they're cut off from everyone. So a Pakistani nuclear scientist has like a target on their back, basically, whenever they leave Pakistan, unfortunately. The second factor is that it's expensive, right? So you need to put quite a bit of money towards reactor development. The good news is that you can do it, but the government needs to invest in it. And it's going to need time. It's going to need a lot of time. And now, if we make the assumption that this investment has been ongoing, it could have been ongoing for 20 years. So there's been potentially work that has been happening, but now you need something to sort of push it over the edge, right?
Yeah.
And this is where I found that Turkey's announcement of wanting to build a nuclear submarine, which in my opinion came out of the blue. Like honestly, it's very interesting.
Very out of nowhere. It was very unexpected.
It's very unexpected, and they know. And I think the world generally knows there are very few places which are going to be willing to collaborate with Turkey on nuclear reactor technology.
Yeah. And that's the same issue we have.
Yeah. And we have the knowledge for it. We have the capacity for it. Yes, it's not as well developed as India's. But see, unlike aerospace, when you throw a project, an initiative like Project Azam on PAC, you're basically throwing a next generation fighter on someone who's not even equipped to design their own tooling, right? There's no connection. There's no from the standpoint of where PAC is sitting, if you ask them to build Project Azam, they cannot even envision it because it's so far out. So you have to take it down a few steps to where they're already at. But you go to Pakistan's nuclear R&D base, like the PAC, you tell them we need to build a miniaturized nuclear reactor for a submarine. Yes, it's very far, but they can see the dot. They can see the goal and they know how to get there, but they're going to then give you like a $30 billion overlay.
Yeah.
And 40 years of development to do, or 20 years of development to do it.
Yeah.
And that's where you have to make a decision. Okay, can you support this? Traditionally, Pakistan's defense budget could not support this because the main priority was getting nuclear weapons, right? The nuclear reactor part is a secondary priority in relation to second strike. However, now you have other countries coming in like Turkey, Argentina, and maybe some others saying, hey, we would love to have, maybe even Saudi Arabia, who knows, right? We would love to have a nuclear powered submarine. Yeah, we would
Yeah.
love to have a nuclear powered submarine. And suddenly Pakistan's like, okay, well, we can help you get there, but we need funding, right? And
Yeah.
now I think this is where this is going to get interesting. I think, we've had retired Pakistan Navy admirals come out and say, like, look, traditionally their strategic goal, the strategic deployment of the PN has been using hybrid approaches, which is basically means you use a conventional submarine with a nuclear tipped missile, but they want to go on a nuclear because they understand that they need the speed and endurance of a nuclear submarine to really, really create that strategic presence in South Asia and to provide that assured second strike capability. So now this is where all what we spoke about up to this point is going to start coming together. And this is where Pakistan Navy is going to be like at a focal point. But again, it's been a responsible player too. It makes it very clear what's conventional and what's going to be nuclear. Yeah. So now I want to move into maybe how the Pakistan Navy's goals could adjust in relation to the recent conflict. So
Yeah.
I think at some level, the Pakistan Navy's come out of this feeling somewhat justified in some areas. But now they're
Yeah.
going to look back and maybe start reprioritizing and moving some things around. And I think we touched on this earlier. Like, for example, you mentioned, they've evidently gone all in on the KAAN ER family. I think they might even consider going up to the KAAN MR for Jinnah class frigate down the line, simply
If it's something that's
because
available.
because they want to extend now their air defense coverage. They've understood that, okay, for our assets to work safely in a conflict scenario, our air defense coverage needs to now extend into 100 kilometers plus.
Well, that's potentially something that they can look at with MBDA, like an NRDI original SAM project with assistance from MBDA Italy, because the issue is with MBDA, you have to make the distinction between MBDA Italy, MBDA UK, MBDA France, MBDA Germany, because they're all separate entities with all separate IP. So when we talk about CAM MR and CAM, we're referring particularly to MBDA UK. When we refer to CAM ER, we're referring specifically to MBDA Italy because they're the IP holder. So, the NIDI could look at an initial, like a homegrown SAM project with MBDA Italy designed specifically for our threat environment, designed specifically for our ships. There's a few options to explore here.
Absolutely. And I think this will be an area worth watching. Again, we've put in a lot of trust in the Pakistan Navy's decision making for good reason. I think it'll be worth watching the space and how they approach SAM technology. And ideally, again, we would love to see all tri-surfaces get together on this and just work with the Pakistan Navy on, because they have the best low to medium range solution available already, right? Now you have a upper altitude, long range umbrella through the Chinese stuff. Great. But now you got to supplement and densify very aggressively at the low to medium range. And I think, we've concluded that the Pakistan Navy is probably on the best track for that already. So let's double down on what they're doing and leverage the partnerships that they have for this.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't think it's unrealistic to expect, potentially the other branches could get in on it. As we said, SMASH is effectively a FATA 2 derivative. So we can see that go the other way as well and develop custom solutions based off of that same, with that same route for the other branches as well.
And we know that, for example, NESCOM had been developing a low to medium altitude air defense system, most likely Chinese derived for now. But again, there's a scope here for a low MADS next generation platform in collaboration with MBDA or some other OEM like South Africa, to leverage the newer technologies, because this is the best. And even these solutions would not be 100% guaranteed. Like even Ukraine, I think, is like a less than 10% interception rate in macro terms. Gives you that better defensibility than having nothing in that space, right? Or having something that's completely woefully out of date. So I think the main lessons were basically you have to thrust vectoring. Thrust vectoring.
Agility,
either an imaging
response
infrared
times as well.
seeker. Either an imaging infrared seeker or an active radar homing. Ideally, modular both. So you mix it up a bit, try to use both essentially, and then that would be your low to medium altitude air defense system.
You could have something dual seeker, stunner missiles and whatnot. They use both the infrared imaging. In fact, there's a Korean short range SAM as well that does the same. But even for our threat environment, I don't particularly think something like that is needed. It's more suited towards those really, really high end threats, jamming and all that stuff. Facing stuff like BrahMos, what we really want is something agile, quick response. A ton of magazine depth and all that sort of stuff.
And scalability. So it needs to be relatively simple to manufacture, which I assume the CAM probably is.
Because CAM is effectively that modular design.
It's only now that it's taken on an urgency. So now I assume the costs are going to drop because the Europeans are going to invest very heavily in it anyways. The next thing, and we touched upon this in relation to the Jinnah class frigate by kind of giving it a very big procurement roadmap and a very long procurement timeline of like 30, 40 years, essentially. But basically, we've assessed that due to the recent conflict, surface vessels in general will probably take a back seat, and the Pakistan Navy will now aggressively prioritize subsurface solutions, primarily
Yeah.
because these surface vessels were designed, the Pakistan Navy sought them for the peacetime role, right? They're there to ensure that there's no Indian naval activity during peacetime. Essentially, it's to show that a sense that the Pakistan Navy is there, it's present.
Presence, yeah.
In wartime, these surface vessels are not going to play a big role. I mean, they might be there to an extent, but they're liabilities.
Yeah,
They're just
exactly.
out there. They're big targets. Navy does not want to have too many of these where they're just going to be literal floating ducks, right?
Yeah.
So the point being is that for the Navy, given there's a tense environment, in all likelihood, if they haven't already, which I believe they have, but they're probably going to prioritize things like the SWATs, potentially increase whatever their order number is. They're going to, I think, potentially, maybe scale back on the surface warship goals in general, and maybe prioritize having more submarines. So maybe the submarine fleet goes from 18 to 24 potentially.
Yeah, it's probably quite likely that it's going to be far greater than 18 anyway, with all of these on the procurement roadmap, to be honest.
And speaking to the Navy's more forward-looking nature, I also expect them to really, really start delving into things like unmanned underwater vehicles, autonomous torpedoes, autonomous mine layers and mine hunters. And maybe if they want to get crazy with the surface warship stuff, maybe look at like advanced USVs with, for example, like unmanned surface vessels with anti-air warfare capability. So that way you do have that surface warfare element that's there, but it's uncrewed, right? And it's small, it's stealthy, and it still brings that baseline anti-air warfare or anti-surface warfare capability in wartime.
Yeah.
So I expect them to sort of go in that direction, which suddenly means that the Navy is going to get really interesting. Very interesting.
But it's always been the most interesting branch. It's just been the quietest about it, to be honest.
Absolutely. So now they're also a buyer of the CM302 supersonic anti-ship cruising missile. I know, Arslan, you said that, they should really make a skip to hypersonic, but do you expect them to double down and build on their current order set for supersonics? Under the assumption that they would want to at least show India that they have the ability to respond in kind?
Yeah, I think the Navy will, but even through domestic programs, and to be fair, we don't actually know what their domestic anti-ship cruising missile solution will be yet. And there's a very good chance it could just be a localized CM302, which would be quite useful in the sense, surface batteries, coastal batteries, because right now we're still heavily reliant on older anti-ship missiles like Harpoon and So I think a CM302 follow-up batch is probably due, or potentially, and actually, in fact, this ties back into Sea Sultan. There needs to be a missile solution for that. What is it going to be? Yeah. It's not going to be Harbars, it's not going to be Barbars, it's not going to be C802s and Harpoons. It's going to be something else. The only real options are a domestic solution via a Sub or Temur, or potentially something like air-launched CM302s. So really, there aren't many options. It's either going to have to, the Navy's either going to have to further invest into CM302s, localize it, bring the production line home, set up, massive coastal batteries and equip our ships and whatnot, or look at procuring other domestic options like Temur or like the Sub, which are potential options as well. Yeah, they're not supersonic, not fast, but they have their own merit of being, stealthy, very advanced.
Exactly. And I think Embraer must be just annoyed at how far the Pakistan Navy could take their own platform.
Yeah, because they wanted an MPA built out of it as well, but
yeah. And this is the thing, right? This is what we mentioned. Look, when you miss out on the Pakistan market, this is this kind of stuff that could happen. This is the best case because at least your platform is getting some celebration. It was funny. As soon as the news of the Pakistan Navy's Embraer project came out, the Embraer said that, we're developing a special mission variant of the same platform, which ironically down the line is something the Pakistan Navy could end up buying because it's already pre-configured for customization work. Because there's no like airliner stuff in it anymore. Like, is this a clean Embraer E190?
Yeah, which is what they do anyway for the airborne early warning stuff. You've got the Netra and you've got the Eerie Eyes and all that stuff.
Exactly. So it's ironic, but it's funny. But again, if you're Embraer or any other defense vendor, this is what happens when you kind of glance over the Pakistani market. You just miss out on these opportunities. And think about it, like MBDA just won a SAM contract for the entirety of the Pakistan Navy's SAM requirements.
Yeah.
Every non-Chinese, even like everything except for the Type 054 is getting the MBDA SAM.
Yeah.
the opportunities are there. It just requires a different approach. Now, Arsan, I know you brought up a few low-hanging fruits here. So, I mean,
Yes.
you've been looking at the European market, and we noticed that there are a bunch of ships that are going to be entering secondhand ships. And we know the Navy has been wanting to move away from secondhand ships, but now if you're prioritizing submarines, you're going to have less funding for new ships. So there could be some potential ways of maybe rebalancing that front if it's still a priority. Can you speak to this?
Yeah, so a really important thing that I brought up is the Royal Navy is retiring its Type 45 destroyers. The last one will be retired by 2038. We'll probably see the first ones be decommissioned within the next 5-6 years. Now, these are 6 really capable ships. They would probably arguably be the most capable ballistic missile defense, anti-air warfare ships in the region. They have 6 ships. They're undergoing a power improvement project because the Type 45 had a really troubled propulsion system. You know, they would lose power at times. And they're also going a refit in terms of weapons. So we're seeing the Type 45 receive 20-something cam cells. Again, commonality with the Pakistan Navy. And that means they can get rid of some of the Asta 15s from their VLS and have Asta 30s in there for proper BMD and AAW. So we see that the Royal Navy is looking to retire some of their Type 45 destroyers, rather all of them. And that's a really potentially quite good option as firstly a means of bulking up the fleet, but also bringing ballistic missile defense, anti-air warfare capabilities of the Pakistan Navy on the cheap. And it's something that I don't really see particularly too many issues coming up in the procurement of. Potentially India may not be too happy, but that's something that would be navigated when the time comes. And also potentially there could be an option from far more comprehensive package from Fincantieri in Italy, where, you know, with the S800 and the U212 NFS, and also some existing FREMs, something you could potentially touch on as well.
Yeah, so I mean, with the Type 45, I think even a secondhand Type 45 acquisition can get expensive, but the advantage for the Pakistan Navy is that it can get them sooner. So the point being is that, you know, let's say you agree to buy 2 of these ships, right, from the Royal Navy, you'll want to upgrade them and customize them to your requirements. So suddenly for the industry, some additional contracts open up in terms of rebuilding the sensor stack, you know, modernizing the weapon systems and what have you. The real benefit for the Pakistan Navy might not be the cost side of it. It could be. I mean, I think, you know, definitely compared to buying a brand new European frigate for sure, but it would be the time. Yeah, it would be the expediency. So suddenly you get that. You know, we were saying that if the Pakistan Navy is going to prioritize long range anti-air warfare, this would be the platform that could immediately equip for it sooner than, let's say, waiting for a Jinnah class frigate, right? So that's one aspect. And in terms of I would say that the Pakistan Navy should be keeping an eye on, and probably is keeping an eye on, the European ship market now, because I feel like these ships are, for example, Italy is offering Greece 2 of its existing FREM frigates. I think these ships are getting prematurely decommissioned primarily because there's a goal on Europe's side to revamp the defense industry, to revitalize it. So they need to get these shipyards some orders and stuff. So suddenly these these older designs, which are meant to last for a very long period of time, are being pushed out sooner.
Yeah,
simply because also, the Europeans need new ships.
They're still good. Very, very capable systems. As I said, it'd probably be arguably be the most capable anti-air warfare ballistic missile defense ship in the region for a long time to come. So these are still very, very capable ships. We know the Europeans also tend to place quite a significance on life cycle and sustainment costs as well, which isn't something that forces with lower budgets have the luxury of looking at. You know, for them, typically upfront cost probably outweighs that life cycle cost.
And that's been eaten as a result of them buying it up with the secondhand ship. Basically, that's been eaten with secondhand ships, so you don't have to worry about the upfront. It's more the life cycle, and then a lot of life cycle costs are very labor related as well, which again for the Pakistan Navy is not a big issue because you have lower labor costs. So I think I think the Pakistan Navy, maybe while it prioritize, and this is a way you can actually leverage the submarine deal to its advantage, right? It could go to like Italy, UK, that'd be very interesting, you know, back full circle, and others, and say, look, we want to buy new systems, you know, we want to buy new sensors, we want to buy a new submarine, whatever, but we need to be able to, we buying from you is going to force us to make trade-offs in our budget. So can you help us meet some of that part way? Can you help us with the surface vessel side of the equation? And they can come out and say, yeah, we can offer you secondhand frigates that could maybe be had for a lower cost. So I think that's where the advantage is going to come in. It'll be very interesting to watch. Now, you add another note here in relation to rethinking how we approach surface vessels. So looking at
Yeah,
modularity and cost control. Can you give some thoughts on that?
yeah. So in fact, this you can link this back to the Type 45 quite well actually. So we can look at the Royal Danish Navy and the way they've conducted their, I probably butchered that, ship class project, and what and they had a really interesting and really clever approach to things where they brought the cost for the hulls down significantly. You've got effectively really, really capable anti-air warfare destroyers, SM2s and Thales Smart L and all these kind of things for like $350-400 million a ship. A really, really low cost for the kind of capability it brings. And the way they've managed to do this is they've modularized everything. Everything is modular, and it's quite a good system in terms of if you have a fleet of 4 ships, at least, 1 or 2 of them will always be down. Now, with this way of doing things, it really brings that cost down. Let me explain why. So what the Royal Danish Navy has done is they've taken all of their weapon systems, their sensors and whatnot, and modularized them. So it's a unit. It's a building block. Think of it as a Lego. Think of the ship hull as your platform, and your Lego that slots into it are these systems. So you've got a module for surface to air missiles. You've got a module for anti-ship missiles. You've got modules for anti-submarine warfare and towed arrays and all these things. So the real sunk cost of these weapon systems is absorbed really easily because these things don't go down with the hull. Your hull might be out of its life, 20, 30 years. But your VLS, that's not been launched, that's not been used particularly rough, could still have tons of life in it. Why waste that? Why throw that away? Why trash it out? Take it out and reuse it. And the other benefit of a solution like this is it also brings that upgrade and the cost of upgrades and the cost of maintenance and sustainment down significantly because you're not taking a ship down with it. When you're, let's say you've got a repair to do on your towed array sonar, that doesn't mean your ship is out of service, right? That means your ship is still at sea. They've just taken out the bit that's broken, or they've replaced it with another one while they fix the one that's broken. Your ship is still fully capable. Your ship is still out at sea doing what it needs to. And also in terms of upgrading, again, your ship is not out of service. Everything that needs to be upgraded can be taken out and your ship sent back to sea to fulfill its duties. So it's a really, really good means of bringing that cost down. And where the Type 45s come into this and link into the Jinnah class frigates is potentially, the Pakistan Navy has reused systems before. It's not new, right? They're using phalanxes from the retired direct glass on the Yarmouks and whatnot. So it's not new. It's not a new concept of the Pakistan Navy to reuse systems that have tons of life left in them. But doing it this way really makes it far more cost efficient, far more time efficient, and also flexible and future proof as well.
I agree. And I think with the Pakistan Navy, you have a lot of fiscal constraint. So being able to re-leverage past procurements as much as possible is a very prudent step, right? So that allows them to invest more on, let's say, the VLS stack and get the high-end VLS stack, knowing that they can carry that forward into a new platform when the old one needs to be retired. So they get just more like life and utilization out of their initial expense, basically.
Yeah, and also the amazing thing is you're not limited to a certain ship, right? Let's say today I've got XYZ ship and I need it to carry out this role, but for some reason I can't use that platform anymore. No problem. I've got another platform that's capable of accepting this module. Great, I can swap it out, but have it fill the boots of the other platform, right? So we could have, Azimuth class, fast attack boats doing AAW via a smaller version of that same module, taking over and filling the role of another ship when it goes down. And it's really good for wartime as well, right? You're going to lose ships, you're going to have losses, but this is a really efficient, quick and easy way to fill the boots of those ships that may have been lost.
Absolutely, I agree. So we will conclude our main discussion here, but it's not the end of the podcast. So we have gotten quite a few questions over the past several weeks, and we endeavored to answer them. So we're not going to go through every single individual question because they're just too many for us to do realistically, but we did try to group them together as much as possible. That being said, if there's something you really want us to talk about or focus on, then please give us an email. It's on our website, or just, respond through the comments from whichever podcast or media platform you're listening to us through, and then we will endeavor to answer those questions. But here are a few questions that we're just going to quickly go through so the first question is, can we build hangars and facilities in our mountains to counter the BrahMos?
No. Well, you can, but what's the point? It's going to be extremely costly, space limited, And the reality is what are you going to put there? Are you going to, store fighter jets there? Great. If the entrance gets cratered, they're not getting out. So no, effectively, no is the answer. Well, you can, but there's no point is the answer, actually.
Great. I agree. Question number 2. Why was Pakistan's response to India so restrained? So I can answer that. There are probably 2 main dynamics. The first is, yes, there is a resource constraint. Now, I don't want to come off and say that Pakistan didn't have a munitions stockpile. It certainly did. But the Pakistani military decision makers, they have to make a call whether they want to use that stockpile for an otherwise controlled conflict scenario, or do they want to reserve it in case the conflict gets out of hand? So what's happening in those 4 days was a controlled conflict scenario that even though it was escalating, it hadn't quite gotten to the stage of a full-scale war. So the Pakistani decision makers, they have to make a call where do they want to expend and engage in such a heavy strike that would immediately escalate the situation and go into a full-scale war and not have enough to provision themselves for the rest of the fight? Or do they want to let, and it sounds a bit off-putting, but do they want to let India take the lead in that? So that once that full-scale conflict happens, then they can then move in and start using everything that they have. So there's that aspect. Secondly, there is a resource constraint aspect in the sense that some of the munitions that they use, like the Fatah 1, Fatah 2, they didn't use the Fatah 2, but they used the Fatah 1. These are brand new munitions, right? These are newly inducted systems. So they've just been in production for a short amount of time, relatively speaking. So it's, they haven't built the intended stockpile up to this point. It's very similar with the air defense story. Like, for example, the top end, long-range, high-altitude air defense systems were activated, but the air defense project was 3 to 4 years running in the PAF to this scale, right? Evidently, the low to medium-range altitude systems were not procured in time of the conflict. It's bad luck. It happens, right? Sometimes a fight comes to you sooner than you anticipate. And now, as we see, we go back to the budgetary discussion, we can notice that Pakistan's budget has steered more aggressively towards upfront procurement for the next few years, right? To make sure that issue does not happen again. So that is why, for example, Saparco just got its budget cut significantly so that if a new space-based system is being sought, like a new satellite, it'll just be bought off the shelf from whoever. So that's the way to want to look at it. And the third aspect, yes, there is a policy aspect as well, because Pakistan depends on America. Pakistan depends on America for IMF funding. Pakistan's been trying to make a case for, investment, and America seems to be pretty much warm to some of that right now. So it has to balance these realities before, going all into a fight. It has to at least ensure that the world understands that this fight is not something that Pakistan sought, that India is imposing on it. And once that message gets established and is broadly accepted by the world's leading actors like China, the US, the UK, and so on, then at that point, then yes, the reins would get loosened up. And that's what America anticipated, was that, okay, like this response from Pakistan, if Pakistan is again forced to respond again, then they could result in an escalatory ladder and create a war type situation or an actual war in South Asia, which goes against American interests, because America wants to ensure that the regions in the world, South Asia and the Middle East, are broadly stabilized, if not at peace, so that it can focus on the Asia Pacific. It's very obvious America is really considering China as the big threat right now. It can't afford to have India and Pakistan just fighting randomly right in the corner there, especially because they're so close to China as well. So to prevent that from happening, they're going to step in and prevent a war. It's not about helping one side or the other. It's about literally preventing a war, because that's just going to destabilize the whole situation, basically. Arslan, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, to be honest, everything you've said sounds about right.
Yep. Question number 3. Should Pakistan increase its J-10 CE fleet to over 80 units? So Arslan, thoughts?
Well, look, what's going to get cut? The funds are not infinite. Let's say the Pakistan Air Force was to increase its order 80 units. What gets cut? Is it JF-17s? Is it J-35s? Is it air defense? I don't particularly think there's the space or the need at the moment to be able to increase the order to such large numbers. There are still large amounts of Mirages that probably still need to go, a squadron or two here or there of F-7s that still need to go. I don't necessarily think the forces have the ability to be able to, well, the Air Force has the ability at the moment or the need to be able to increase the order to 80. But this is something you'll probably touch on a lot better than me.
So in general, the Pakistan Air Force, it doesn't commit to a new fighter platform unless it has plans to buy at least 80 units. So every time you look at any fighter platform that Pakistan paid through with its own money, like the F6, Mirages, F16s, JF17s, it's always been a plan to have at least 5 to 6 squadrons. I mean, I remember even in the 90s when they were talking to France about the Mirage 2005, for example, the air chief at the time, he basically said that, look, we when we decide to buy a platform, we really plan for about 80 units, right? So we have to take the whole cost into account when we select a platform. So this is why, for example, the PAF selected the J10 and not the Eurofighter to an extent. I mean, obviously there are other factors, but it'd be much more difficult to absorb 80 Eurofighters, right, than as opposed to 80 J10s. That being said, the J10 was procured years before this conflict, right? It was procured with the assumption that the PAF would still have some space to continuously induct batches of J10s over the long term, right? I don't think they even anticipated the availability of the J35, right, when they procured the J10, meaning that the next generation fighter question was supposed to come much later. It seems that all this is being accelerated, and as a result, with the recent government announcement of 40 35s, as a result of certain changes in procurement planning and the recent conflict, I think the planning for building the J10 fleet might have been deprioritized. However, I still think it's still going to be there because you have all this existing infrastructure you need to use. Like you have people being trained on the fighter and that kind of thing. So I think it'll still happen, but in a much longer term cycle, in much smaller batches. Like I would anticipate you might hear like of 6 J10s bought at one point or 12 at another point over like a longer time period, as opposed to them just saying we're going to buy 60 right now. Who knows? We're in a world where big procurement announcements are made out of nowhere in Pakistan, so it could be a thing, but I would say that in all likelihood, as you said, trade-offs have to be made, and given the attention the J35 program is getting, that might have taken up the PF's near-term resources. So next question, are Chinese air defense systems enough to stop Brahmos? So I just want to preface this here. The question isn't whether Chinese or European air defense systems are enough to stop the Brahmos. The question is whether Pakistan built enough of a network and densification to do it. So the HQ-9BE, for example, Pakistan's long-range SAM, is a good SAM, right? It's derived from a good platform. It gets the job done in a context. That context is that China has way more strategic depth than Pakistan. Now, that being said, China is also, their threat environment is evolving as well. They have surface warships that are like right up against the US Navy. So perhaps they will need to start investing in the cutting edge anti-air warfare technology down the line as well. So that shift can happen, right? It'll probably will happen. The other side of the issue is that Pakistan's air defense system was, as we discussed, top heavy, meaning that it emphasized long range, high altitude applications, but it was not as well developed in the low to medium range segment. And this is not because of a lack of planning or anything. The reality is that the Air Force started investing in air defense seriously in 2022 or 2021. So you have a lead time of 3 to 4 years, and it takes a while to not just induct a system, but then to properly integrate it into your environment and get people, your crews, trained on it and to deploy it. So 3 years is a very short amount of time to basically open up an entire new sub-force within your structure. Like, think of it this way. Traditionally, air defense in the Pakistan Air Force was like this point defense entity at the short to very short range layer. It was meant to defend against, low-flying threats or threats that just make it through the fighter fleet and are about to hit air bases and stuff. It was not designed for territorial defense that we've seen now. So what happened was in 2021, 2022, the air chief, he decided to make air defense a big priority. So now you open this additional substructure within the Air Force, right? A large air defense cadre, basically, with its own with probably its own authority in the sense that it has its own command structure that works within the wider PF framework and what have you. And suddenly it needs a lot more personnel allocated to this, right? A lot more personnel, like way more than what they've had before. So this was a work in progress that just unfortunately got tested a bit sooner than anticipated. The fact is NESCOM was developing a low to medium range altitude air defense system. So they understood there's a gap. Clearly they understood there's a gap. And the fact that they were giving it to the domestic industry indicated that they saw that they needed to densify and acquire a lot of these low to medium range air defense systems. Now, when the conflict happened, I think it would force a change in how they specify what the solution should be. I think they're going to want a missile that's much more agile, much more quick to respond, has thrust vectoring and all that kind of stuff, to deal with the BrahMos threat, because now they've actually dealt with the BrahMos threat, right? This has been a theoretical threat. Now it's a real, like, now you've faced it. Now you know how it's going to affect you. So I would say that, if the Chinese develop a solution, let's say they take the PL-10 and develop a SAM based on that, it could be probably a pretty good SAM for the role, essentially.
Yeah, effectively. But there's not really a whole lot to add to that, to be honest.
And finally, the question that I think stirred off a bit of a media storm is Pakistan really considering the IRST SL or surface launch? So just for some context, interestingly, a couple of days after one of our podcast episodes where we had mentioned the IRST and discussed a little bit about it and how Germany had offered it to Pakistan back in 2018, a bunch of news media outlets ran with a story saying that Germany was quietly marketing the solution to Pakistan. Just to be clear, there's no information suggesting that to be the case at the moment. It could be, potentially, possibly, but not definitively, because there's no statement or any indication of such. It basically came from information from our podcast, which was misconstrued. So just to be clear, what we said was that the IRST SL could be an option for Pakistan in relation to its emerging requirements in the low to medium altitude environment. Yeah. It was an option that had previously been offered to Pakistan back in 2018, 2016. At that time, obviously Pakistan's understanding of SAM systems in relation to conflict was not as well developed, simply because it was not a priority. But now maybe they perhaps saw that it was a short-range system, wouldn't necessarily fit with their needs. They need a longer-range system, so they prioritized those. But now, seeing what happened with the recent conflict, they'll come back and revisit the short to medium-range air defense systems and potentially look at the IRST SL as a solution. That being said, if they don't acquire it, I would say that in general, we should assume that given their experience, they'll acquire an analogous system. So these sorts of attributes, you can pretty much find them in many different designs, from, for example, the Denel Junto, from the MBDA CAM to the IRST SL, obviously, and even potentially a Chinese solution down the line, which I assume the Chinese will look to develop in order to get on the Pakistani market.
Right, yeah. So they are looking at an original solution via the Skydragon 50 paired with like some local radars or whatever they may have already. So it's already something being looked at. But in terms of the likelihood of something like the IRST SL, I'd say if it's still on offer by the OEM, I'd rate it quite high, right? Because it's performed exceptionally well in our exact threat environment. And also, the biggest benefit is we already operate the radars and some systems used within an IRST SL battery anyway. It's also a relatively easier integration job because we already have half the picture there. Does this mean we're going to integrate it? Does this mean Germany is selling IRSTs to Pakistan? No, of course not. Does this mean somebody has told us under the table that there are IRSTs being inducted tomorrow? No, of course not. So put the news stories away. This is purely our opinion based off of what we see, us connecting the dots. And yeah. So in terms of Chinese development for the Pakistani market, we've seen that the Pakistan Air Force via NASTP or whatever has been looking at developing their own system from the ground up using a Chinese interceptor, the Skydragon 50, which we talked about last episode as well, is seemingly like an adaptation of the SD-10 missile, which is in widespread use with the Pakistan Air Force and is even produced locally. So we can see that there is some work in this field already going on, with the with the Skydragon 50 paired with like a local radar like NASTP's SRR-3D, or even the Spada's fire control radar, the Sky Guard. And also, on the other hand, in terms of the IRST SL, Pakistan already operates quite a lot of henceforth radars, particularly the ones seen with the IRIS batteries. So you've kind of got half the picture already there. So it really brings an interesting value proposition that Deal could present is, look, you already operate half the system. You already operate half. You've got part of the equation there. Let us complete the equation for you with the IRST, which has been proven in the exact or a very similar threat environment to what you're facing, and to a reasonably high degree of success as well. Like, it's fared very, very well in Ukraine, and it's facing the kind of threats we're facing, and it does the job really well. Quick reaction, resistance to countermeasures, really capable, really high success rate, or potentially even something like KAAN as well. So, but does this mean that Germany has offered it? No. This was information based off of stuff we had known before. Is it still on offer? Probably. Nothing has changed, right? I wouldn't be surprised if it's still on offer. Does this mean it's being procured? No. Does this mean a deal has been signed? No. It's all our analysis based off of the dots we're connecting. So yeah.
Great. So we will leave the episode there. Once again, if you have questions, comments, do email us at podcasts@koa.org. The email address is also on the articles that we publish with the podcast episodes. We'll add the email as well to the YouTube comments section or description section. So be sure to reach out to us with your questions and we'll try to get back to you as well. So once again, I thank you all for listening to another episode of Defense Uncut, and we will see you again next week. Take care and bye.